Lisa Louise Cook here at Roots Tech 2018. And one of the terrific things about this year's Roots Tech is I'm getting a chance to get together in person with some of the wonderful contributors that we have here on the Genealogy Gems podcast. And as you can imagine, some of the best talent isn't in my own backyard. And so I seek them out as I travel around the country. And we found, of course, a wonderful expert in military research, Michael Strauss. Now, Michael, you and I met first at the Family History, BYU Family History Conference. I remember we talked then.
It was a couple years ago that we had met.
Yeah, and he had terrific knowledge, plus a great voice for audio. So I figured we just had to have him on the show, and it's been a really fun addition to the show. But today, we have a few extra minutes, and so in this opportunity to introduce you in person to everybody who listens and watches, I wanted to invite you to share some of the incredible stories that you have uncovered over the years of your research, because I think they're just wonderful examples and I think very inspiring. I know one of the ones we talked about was World War I.
Yes, we did.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about some of the things that you've come across and some of the puzzles over the years.
Well, and there certainly have been no shortage of them.
Yes.
I don't know if you know this, but I started actually doing family history when I was about 12 years old.
Oh, wow.
And I started in middle school as a middle school student, and I initially had no real interest in family history. I went to my parents and virtually got no help from them, and went to my grandparents, who in turn did help me. And it was there that I really got hooked on family history and started to really move forward with the idea of trying to discover my real roots. And I became very quickly infatuated with one aspect of family history, and that was, of course, researching military ancestors. I was particularly very involved in that. And when I got older, I decided it was time for me to become more involved, and I got involved with Civil War reenacting. I've been doing reenacting for 25 years, and I have the part for it. I have the look of a reenactor, and I thoroughly enjoy it. And I think it's dovetailed nicely into my obsession, if you will. Mm-hmm. Some might consider it unhealthy, but I consider it a very healthy obsession. I could be doing something altogether bad that's not good for me, but I have uncovered a lot of stories just to my own family, but in researching for others as well. We all know that this year marks the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I.
Right.
So the war ends this year, November 11th, on the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour of 1918. So this year we are remembering those veterans who had given up their lives during the war. Remember, the U.S. didn't get involved until 1917.
Right.
But Europe was already fighting for 3 years. So Americans, not only who served in America, there were Americans who also served in Canada, who served in New Zealand, who served in the British Army prior to America's involvement. They also forfeited their lives as well. And I think I find that having done genealogy for so long, I'm not alone, and I know this. I am certain that there are many people out here and your listener viewers that have memorabilia. They have ephemera. They have diaries, letters, journals, maybe memoirs, postcards, things like that. And I think one of two things happens. I think maybe one, they know who wrote the material, but they may not have any information as to how to substantiate the information that's on the document. Like a diary, for an example. They can see the diary entries, but they may not know how to substantiate that information to prove that it's true.
Exactly.
And then the other side of the coin, and you always have another side, is you may have someone who has a piece of history, and it's great, but they don't have any idea who wrote it. And you have to try to find the clues to the rest of the story. And those are truly the gems, I think.
Absolutely.
And I have an example I'd like to share with you on World War I.
Yes.
And I brought it with me. And what I have here is some items, some postcards that I purchased.
Great.
This is actually not my family. These were postcards I purchased on eBay. I want to tell you right now, straight up, that eBay is a great place to do your genealogy, and don't let anybody steer anyone the wrong direction, because I have purchased so much from my own family and others as well, because I have an interest in all things military. And I purchased these postcards for a reason. There are a dozen of them. And these postcards all were mailed from France. And when they were all mailed within a period of a couple months of each other. So you can see them here. They're not very large. They're very faded over the years.
Right.
And they are all dated. So the postcards were all dated between December of 1918, so it was right after the end of the war, but not all Americans came home right away. Some stayed on longer.
Right,
I mean,
right.
the armies disbanded at different times. And the last one is dated May of 1919, so several months after the end of the war. And the postcards all have one thing in common. They all were written by the same hand, and all the postcards, not all of them had an address on who they were being sent to, but 2 of the 10 had a recipient. And it was listed as simply Ms., so it was a single woman, Miss Rosamond M. Stevens. And they were all signed with initials, CSS. No name.
Now, are these
just
picture
initials.
postcards? Or are they just plain? Oh,
no,
they
these
are.
were picture postcards. They are all of sites in France that were bombed as a result of the war.
Wow.
So these are all areas of France that had seen devastation as a result of the World War, where the Americans, the Germans, and the French and the British were all fighting.
Right.
Right in the thick of the fighting. And it was mailed from these towns where this soldier presumably had gone through. And the only information I had as to who was the author was his initials, and that simply that name of that woman with her address, not even a street address, just a town in New Hampshire. That was all that I had to start with.
Oh,
I had
my
nothing more.
gosh.
So I did what I think a normal genealogist would do. I kind of approached this with simplicity. I believe by overthinking it and doing and just way over the bounds, I think that was the wrong way to approach it. For me, it was more like taking this from a simple point of view. So I sought to look for this family because I had a clue with Rosamond.
Yes.
And I looked for her in the 1900, 1910, and 1920 census. Either one of a couple of things. Either this was going to be a sibling, a parent, or possibly a boyfriend. It's clearly not her husband.
Right.
Because she's listed as Ms.
Right.
So she's single. So it had to be one of those 3, or maybe a friend. That was also the possibility. So when I looked at the census records, I quickly discovered that in the Stevens family in New Hampshire, where this family came from, and it was just a very small town called Kingston, which is near Portsmouth, I found the family unit in a census.
Great.
And one of the census members was an older brother named Carl Stevens. Carl S. Stevens.
So you got your CSS.
So CSS
Good candidate.
was a very good candidate for it. But you know as well as I do, doing genealogy, you can't take that very first step
no.
and assume that you have the right person.
Right.
You need to go to the next step, which is try to determine, was indeed this Carl Stevens a soldier? So I had to try to get myself and put myself into the context of time during World War I. So I did that by looking for his World War I draft registration. The very first military minutes I shared with you was on those draft registrations and how important they were.
And the beauty of them was that you did not have to actually serve in the military to be listed in the draft.
Exactly
so
right.
You have a military record without necessarily service.
Exactly. And in the case of this man, I found his World War I draft. It didn't indicate any military service, but I knew that he was there at least at the time of the draft registration in 1917
Would they
when it
have
was filled out.
updated it? Would they have gone back and said, okay, he was in the, here's his draft card, and yes, he actually did enter?
They may have notated it.
Okay.
It was highly unlikely that they would not. What they typically would notate instead of federalized service was National Guard service.
Oh, okay.
That was
Something more
often
local.
notated, or prior military service.
Right.
As that was one of the questions that was asked in the remarks section at the bottom.
Okay.
Now, when I did find him on there, I was, of course, ecstatic because I was, again, one step closer.
Yeah.
So I proceeded next to try to put him into Europe, because I know if he's going to be a soldier, he had to have traveled to France.
Particularly if he is this gentleman on
Right,
the card.
if he is this
Yes.
gentleman on the card. So at that point, I had to determine whether or not he indeed had gone to France, if he had served in the war. Fortunately, the ship's passenger list, called transport ships, those records, leaving the United States and coming back to the United States are both recorded. They are National Archives records.
Right.
They have been held for many years at the College Park, Maryland Archive branch, the Archives 2 it's called. And recently, within the last several months, Ancestry was able to digitize these records and put them online.
Terrific.
Before that, you had to go to the location.
In person.
You physically had to make the pilgrimage
Right.
to College Park to look at those records. So now I could do it from the comfort of my home.
Excellent.
At night, whatever time I wanted during the day.
Right.
And I did that. And I found Carl S. Stevens listed on the outgoing ship manifest with the name of his vessel, which was the SS Kronlin. Most ships departed from Hoboken, New Jersey, and they also returned to the same port city. That was a major port for the transfer of troops to the war zone. He showed up on both the outgoing and the incoming ship manifests.
Wow.
But what it did tell me was key ingredient information, the key gems that I needed. His name, his service number, his military unit, company and regiment. And he was an engineer, and I had his company. So I knew that he had served in an engineering regiment and battalion. And then when I came back, I had that date as well. But more importantly, it gave me his nearest relative and that person's relationship. And the nearest relative was his mother. Both Rosamond, whose mother was obviously the same woman, and him shared the same mom, same
Which we
dad.
can verify in the census.
Which I can verify in the census. I was able to substantiate that I indeed had the right individual at the right time.
And you had dates on
And I
here,
had
so you
dates
could
on
make
here.
sure, you could almost plot him out just to make sure that this lines up with this military service.
He had arrived in France in August of 1918, and he started writing his postcards in December. He wrote his last postcard in May of 1919, and he departed on the SS Patricia in June of 1919.
Wow.
So for a very short period of time in his life, he wrote these cards, sent them to his sister in the United States, and then returned himself. What an amazing story to be able to piece all of that together, simply based on a simple email, a simple eBay purchase that I had done. I paid $10
Right.
for the cards. It was a reasonable price to me, but to be able to put a name and a face
And a
to it,
story.
and a story
to
to
pull
it.
the story. You know, I can almost, as you're talking about it, visualizing those cards, they're sitting out there on eBay on the edge. They're on the edge of either falling into oblivion and just being lost. Nobody buys them. Eventually they get lost, tossed aside. Or you grab them and you pull them back into history and give them names and give them context again. And I just think that's wonderful, because certainly nobody wants to be forgotten. Nobody wants their history to be lost. And you've really restored that. That's
Yes,
tremendous.
and I have not forgotten. As a matter of
Yeah.
fact, I take the opportunity to share it when I lecture, because I think it makes a great story, and more importantly for genealogists,
Yeah.
it shows the methodology
Exactly.
that was used to be able to uncover the truth.
Quite a variety of tools, and you had to do them in a certain order, really, to have it make sense and unfold.
But none of the tools were advanced tools.
Exactly.
That's the beauty of it.
Anybody can do that.
Anyone can do this.
Exactly.
Anyone.
Well, and those of you listening who've heard the podcast for a while know that I'm passionate about eBay. I have shared, Michael, gosh, so many of the finds, even down to the streetcar ticket from 1906 that my great-grandfather, that was his car, that was his line. He ran it as a conductor in San Francisco, and I often kid and say, I know that DNA was on there. He would have grabbed it and punched it, right? It's tremendous to see that little bits and pieces that seem like a little something, okay, I'll try and sell this on eBay, could be a restoration of your own family history.
And I would
Or
encourage,
somebody else's.
Absolutely, I would encourage your listeners to look in these places they may have never have searched before. Think outside the box is really what I'm saying.
Exactly.
I mean, besides the usual genealogy records you get online or in an archive or a library, it's finding these things that really are the real true treasures, and finding them in places you would never, ever, ever expect.
Everything to look. You've got so much more to look forward to at Genealogy Gems, because Michael you have a treasure trove of these stories, don't you?
I have enough to share with you for the next 2 years.
There you go. And he will be, and not only sharing the stories, but as you just heard, the methodology, and where do you get your hands on these records, and how has the access to the records changed? What maybe once was an in-person visit is now online. All of this is here for you to keep abreast of, and that's what we're going to do here at Genealogy Gems. Michael, such a joy, of course, to have you here in person, and thank you so much for contributing and leading all of our listeners and our viewers to their military gems. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us here for our Rolling Out the Red Carpet YouTube series. Now be sure to click that red subscribe button here on our YouTube channel, and that will get you notifications as each new video comes out. Thanks so much for watching, friend. I'll talk to you soon.